we've been working on that since last September, and we were so excited to share it with you. So I'm just telling you, I could go home right now. The most fun I can worry about. So that was great. The other thing I want to say is I want to really, I'm grateful, and I'm a little kind of like gun shy and embarrassed for all the attention being splashed out on us for this going away. And I just want to say, I'm kind of overcome by such kindness. So I just wanted to say that. And I have nothing to do with it, so I just want you to know. It's all a surprise to me. So, we're walking through the prophets. We're reading it in the Immerse Bible, which takes out chapter and verse. So we're trying to just soak in it. It's a difficult part of the Bible to soak in for long. I don't know if all of you are hanging in there with it. I was thinking it might be like a hot shower in the prophets, but I was thinking now it's actually more like a cold shower in the prophets. It's hard reading. There's amazing treasures in it. We read the book of Jeremiah this last week, and I want to reflect on his life today through the text of Jeremiah. The question that I have, as you read the book, there is all of this battle between false prophet and Jeremiah, true prophet. My question is, how would the normal Joe or Jane, I'm looking at Jane Young at that very moment, how would the normal Joe or the normal Jane decide who is telling the truth? We read it from hindsight. We think, Jeremiah, of course, was the true teller. But how would you have known that back then? In fact, you come to chapter 27, 28, 29, a very dramatic showdown between two prophets. Jeremiah, who God called him to put on a yoke, which was like a wooden beam, and he wore it on both sides of his shoulders around as a prophetic sign that Babylon would come and take over Jerusalem and take the people away for 70 years. He was walking around making this message, which made the kings and the other prophets so mad. So there came a guy named Hananiah, chapter 28. He comes up, he breaks the yoke, and he says, "Thus says the Lord, Babylon will not have its way here. And in fact, the stuff that they've already taken away to Babylon will come back in 2 years, as will the son of the king who had been taken away earlier." The Babylonian taking away of Jerusalem happened in 3 phases. So here we're after phase 2, and Jeremiah is saying it's going to get worse, people. And Hananiah is saying, no, the end has come. Who would you have believed? Well, who would you have wanted to believe? Let me tell you how often we believe the things, or we tend to believe what we want to believe. I was thinking, well, there's one way to tell. Let's see whose words come true. Jeremiah says, "Hananiah, you are a false prophet, and because you are falsely prophesying in the name of the Lord, this year you will die." In the 7th month of that year, Hananiah died. Case closed. We saw whose words came true and whose words didn't. But you know what? The call of Hananiah saying in 2 years all that stuff's going to come back, that's a long time to wait to figure out who's telling the truth. What if you need to get a beeline on who's telling the truth sooner than waiting for things to pan out? Anybody remember the Harold Camping drama about, 5, 6 years ago? A radio religious personality who was predicting the return of Christ on a very specific day, bought thousands of dollars worth of billboards, advertising in the Bay Area and beyond for that. And, he had guts. The day came and Jesus didn't come back. You know what's interesting? Do you know he had a stroke soon after that and he lost his voice? Oh. It's interesting for a radio broadcaster to lose his voice. Had a very prophets-like drama going on back then. And I'm not. All I'm saying is interesting contemporary event of a person supposedly speaking for the Lord whose stuff didn't come true, which equals false prophet. What do we do, though, if we don't have time to see the thing play out? What's another way we might want to test the polar opposite voices that we often hear in our own heads or in the Christian community or out in the world? How might we judge? So how about this next solution for judging truly or discerning this is the Lord or not? Let's go with majority opinion. I hear some chuckles. Are those skeptics out there? Let me challenge you, because Proverbs 11 will tell us without guidance there's great danger, but in a multitude of counselors there is victory, there is safety, it says. All right, I think there's a principle that in unanimity and unity of multiple good leaders, there can be some safety. In fact, through the years of Hillside, when we've had a lot of complex things, hard to know the way to go, my refuge has been in that group of us getting around, our heads around the table, and being of one mind. Even if we're not totally sure it's the right way to go, we're together. There's a safety net in being together. So there's something to that. But those of you who chuckled correctly, because the book of Jeremiah shows Jeremiah as the singular, the idiosyncratic individual, the wacky one on the periphery and perimeter were the words I was looking for. I ended up saying parishioner, which is an interesting combo. On the perimeter, Jeremiah. And I tend, the singular voice, like the Harold Camping voice, I tend to dismiss. I tend to find safety in the consensus voice. But listen, this is what God was saying about the prophets, the collective official prophets of Judah at the time. I'm reading here just from Jeremiah 23. This was God's assessment of them, though they be in number. Don't listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes. They speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They say continually of the Lord. They say continually to those who despise the word of the Lord, it shall be well with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster shall come upon you. For who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see and to hear his word? Or who has paid attention to his word and listened? I did not send the prophets, yet they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. Man, we got a little problem here. The consensus group, it could be a safe place to go, but it might not be. The singular voice might be a wacky individual, or it might be the voice of the Lord. Where else can we go for this question? How do we discern a word that comes down? Is it of the Lord or not? How do we tell? Okay, let's get away from the personality of people, the subjectivity of people, and let's go to the given words of God. How about that? Inspired words captured by people, given to us to reference, to referee, to arbitrate. The Covenant Church, our history, we love to say this, where is it written? Tell me what you think, but tell me where it comes from. Yes, suddenly I feel some solidity under my feet. Yes, we have something outside of us to go to. And yet, oh, and yet, the problem, what is it? The subjectivity of the interpreter. Here we are again. Interesting. Dr. Jack Lundbaum, father of Jeannie Lundbaum, was just singing in the choir. World-renowned scholar on Jeremiah was talking to her this week on behalf of our little study group in the book of Jeremiah. And he told us this. He said, one of the reasons perhaps the Jeremiah community were not listening to him is because they were still holding onto the Isaiah scrolls. A little background. Isaiah had written about 100 years earlier. The greater themes in Isaiah's book were themes of deliverance for Judah from the great enemy from the north. And if you remember in the middle of that book, what happened was Assyria under Sennacherib sent down this huge army, surrounded Jerusalem. King Hezekiah cried out to God, and God sent an angel. They woke up one morning, or the Jews woke up one morning, and 185,000 of the Assyrians had been killed in the night. And they went home. It was an amazing deliverance. It's interesting the thesis that the community of Jeremiah's day, hearing now Jeremiah prophesy the doomsday of Jerusalem, was saying, but let's read Isaiah now. And though God doesn't change and God doesn't lie, God speaks differently in different times because times have changed. And the same stable God point has different things to say relative to a changing world. So even appealing to the word for them misled them from hearing the word that God was speaking to them in their day. How about that? I'm trying to make this as complicated as I possibly can. Let me actually go further for us. Anybody know what I think is the most famous verse in Jeremiah? Maybe one of the most famous verses in the Bible. It's on most posters that you'll find in a Christian bookstore, or we send it to each other when we're feeling down. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Beautiful. I myself have read that at times where I've been in a hard place. I go, oh, yes, I'm not done yet. God's got a plan and a future. Is it legitimate to take hope in that particular verse? I'm going to say there's a place for it, but let me give you a pretty big caveat. There's a lot of irony in that particular verse because that verse comes in chapter 29, after 28, after Hananiah, the false prophet, had said to Israel, nothing bad's going to happen to you. In fact, it's all going to be over in 2 years. That's a really good word for your future and hope. Chapter 29, Jeremiah says, here's the verse right before 29:11. It's 29:10. It says, you will go into Babylon for 70 years, and after that time is complete, thus says the Lord, I have plans for you to give you a future and a hope. Something about reading it in context says, yes, there's a future and a hope, but there's 70 years of captivity in that context that we usually don't send to each other when we're down, right? Now let me quickly add this caveat, because have you ever had the experience where you're just down and you open up the Bible and then there's this like word just to you? One time I was praying for, I was like so fearful in my soul, and I was praying, God, would you just give me boldness? I just want boldness in my life. And I just did one of those open up the Bible things. Psalm 138 fell open, and here's the verse right before my eyes. I kid you not, it's meant the world to me all my life. It read, on the day that you called to me, I answered you with boldness in your soul. I'm still waiting to tell you the truth for it. Or else it's coming in like super little tiny drops. But I absolutely believe that was God using his word to meet me in the moment. And I had no idea of the context of that verse. And God can do that, and he can do that to you too. In fact, I say this on the authority of watching how the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament in the New Testament. If you ever want to do a very interesting study, look at all the places where the New Testament writers go back. This was prophesied in the Old Testament. Look at the verse, go find it. Look at the context in which it came from in the Old Testament, and you're going to just scratch your head and going, what? How'd they get that out of this? Very rarely is there a sort of a contextual move from Old Testament to its use in the story of Jesus. And you might say, well, how'd they get away with that? And you go, well, they had the Holy Spirit inspiring them. But I would say this, is that the scriptures are malleable and huge in the hands of God, and he can use any part of the text to speak personally to you, but that does not invalidate the actual contextual message that was written down originally, and we should always go ground zero there first. If we want to believe that God's speaking to us to encourage us, that's a good possibility, but let's first understand that Jeremiah 29:10 says 70 years of captivity, and then comes a future and a hope, because that just might temper our ability to hear the good news in a way that might be helpful. So I don't want to overly squish that practice. God has used it in my life a lot. I just say, proceed with caution. Now, all of that was a bit of an excursus from my main point. We're asking the question this morning, how do we discern the voice of the Lord in a word, a leader, a teacher, when there's these different opposites, and how do we do that? We've said, well, to see who comes true, that's a good way to do it, but often that takes time. So we said, well, Can we lean to the majority or the singular voice? Well, could be both. Could be neither. So he said, let's go to the Word. Let's test the Word against the written Word. Yes, yes, yes. But there's the problem of human subjectivity there. So what do we say to that? Proposed solution. We approach the Word. We approach whatever thing we're trying to discern with a pure, humble, disinterested, unselfish, surrendered heart. Good. I like where we're going. Jesus himself said, John chapter 7, verse 17, he said this, if anyone is willing to do my will, that person will know if my teaching is from the Father or not. Jesus linked the condition of the heart, the posture of the listener, to the ability to discern the source of where that teaching is coming from. Good? How's all of your heart? How are you doing on the humble, pure, disinterested, unselfish factor? How you all doing? Let me tell you what Jeremiah says, chapter 17, to this very condition. He says it this way. Jeremiah 17 says, oh, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every person according to his or her ways, according to the fruit of his or her deeds. The curse that has fallen the world has this, is that we are bent, our hearts are bent away from wanting to hear God. We are confounded by self-interest. Whether you think you are or not, it's so ingrained into our being. We hardly know it's there. So if that's our factor, being able to hear clearly the Lord, our level of sort of unself-interest, unselfishness, we got another problem. What do we do about that? You know what we need? We need the divine surgeon of heaven to come and do an operation and change something within us. Suddenly, we find ourselves right at Jeremiah 31, the center of the book. I've put that particular passage on the back of your outline if you'd like to see it there, or turn to Jeremiah 31, verse 31. And this is what God says. He's got a plan for solving this conundrum of how his people can know him, can hear his voice clearly and truly. Verse 31 of chapter 31, this is what God said to Jeremiah. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their forefathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his or her neighbor, each teach the other, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Right in the middle of the strange prophetic book of Jeremiah, the promise of God, as he looks down on the condition of the world, he says, I've got a plan. I'm going to change the whole chemistry of the cosmos. I'm going to do something different than I did before, which before is I made a law out here, an external law that would work by pressure and restraint and reward. It would be out here. It would tell people the way of life. And it would say, if you follow this way, it's going to go good for you. And there's all this blessing. But if you don't, there's all these problems that's going to happen. Your life's going to implode. There's going to be punishment and judgment, all this stuff. So follow the way of life. But it was coming from out here, speaking to all these hearts that didn't really want to follow God. Maybe here and there for a little bit, but we're always bent back to saying, no, I'd rather go my own way. Go my own way. That's the stuff in the human heart. So God says, I'm going to make a new covenant, an agreement, a new arrangement. And by the way, new covenant is only, in the entire Old Testament, this is the only place you see that phrase, new covenant. Where do you see that phrase in the New Testament? Exactly, Jim. When Jesus opens up the Last Supper, and he takes out that cup and he says, this is the new covenant in my blood. Hearkening back to Jeremiah 31, verse 31. Here's the idea. God says, I'm going to write my law in their hearts. No longer is it going to be out here kind of pressuring them to do what they need. I'm going to put something in them that will rise out of from my spirit, and their intrinsic desires and their thoughts. Their inclination will be toward me, and they'll begin to move away from me and not like it and want to move back into the light. They'll be like moths drawn to the light from within. I think of it like food. Can you imagine? We need food to live, correct? Can you imagine if you were born and we were all born in such a way that we hated to eat? So much so that we needed laws to force people to eat their breakfast. And I'm not talking now about eating good vegetables and stuff. I'm just talking about eating. Because you need to eat. But what if you just hated eating? And so we had to like enforce it. Did you eat your breakfast this morning? Nope, go to prison. We're going to force feed you in prison. You know, it's kind of a funny idea, right? Why I bring that up is because we don't have that problem. We want to eat naturally. We wake up in the morning and we go, I want to eat. And I pour my bowl of grape nut flakes, my cold 2% lactose-free milk right on top of those things. Oh, that is a good cereal. The crackling oat bran. Man, I love eating. Right, amen to that one. Comes noon, I want to eat. I don't have to tell myself, oh, it's time to want to eat to survive. It rises up in me because I'm wired to eat. Well, we're also wired to live for God. It's the way of health. It's the way of life. Unfortunately, it doesn't rise up from within us. In fact, the opposite does. It's like a bunch of people that are just really hungry for poison food. It's kind of a strange situation we're in. So God says, I'm going to change it. I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to do something so different that rising up inside of you, I will write my law on your heart. You're going to actually desire me. You're going to want to know me. That voice, you're going to be able to hear and know me. Because Jesus said, my sheep, he said in John 12, know my voice. What a different way it's going to be. And what's the promise right here in Jeremiah 31? Everyone's going to know the Lord. That word know has the idea of know and do. You won't have to admonish each other and say, come on, follow the Lord. Everyone's going to be wanting to follow him. That's the picture of the new heart, the new age. The miracle that was made possible when Jesus came into the world and broke through this great wall of sin and captivity by dying into it, paid off its great debt, broke its power, rose from the dead, come home to the Father, surgeries for everybody, reconnect your heart. We're not going to give you a new heart, but we're going to refashion, reconstitute, remake, resurrect your heart so that it's so connected to God, so connected to the Spirit that his thoughts will start breathing through you. His desires will breathe through you. His will start moving up through your will. And you and him will just start moving into this congruency. That's the picture. That's the solution. That's how we're going to eventually know the Lord's voice, because we're going to know it from within. Because our hearts will be drawn to it. Oh, thank you. Yes, Alex. Amen to that. So, question. Those of us who live on the other side of the cross, that we've said we are followers of Jesus, we have had the divine surgery. There's the new heart in us that's been shaping. So are we good? I mean, do we know the Lord's voice automatically now? I wish it were so simple. I'll tell you why it's not so simple. Because that fullness of knowing the Lord fully from inside is going to be perfected in what I call the new age, when all things are made new. We're moving toward it, but we're not there yet. So let's call it in the toddler stage of the new covenant era. And the toddler stage is always a little bit awkward. So when Paul is directing the church at Corinth on how to function with this kind of new heart reality, he calls the prophets to engage and speak God's words to each other right there in their worship service. But notice something. Notice the call for discernment and restraint he gives to them when he says this. All right, let 2 or 3 prophets speak and let the others weigh what is said. Notice that? Immediately, there's a need for discernment. For you can all prophesy one by one so that all may learn and be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject or to be submissive to other prophets. In other words, there is, even now in the toddler age of the new covenant, a kind of need for discernment as we grow up into this new way of living with God. And so, discernment required. And I would think of discernment kind of like an overlay of the very things we've been talking about this morning. The inner voice, the inner witness, the scriptures themselves, and trusted and wise counselors. Put all those on top of each other, and if they all start lining up, we start getting a confidence that, yeah. I think this is all lining up. I think I can step forward into this. But we do so challenging each of those aspects. The inner voice, we think we hear our hearts, and we can start trusting our hearts more and more, by the way. That heart is deceitful stuff. That's Jeremiah passage. Jesus living within us. I want to tell you, you can start trusting your heart. Dare to trust your heart a little more. Not all the way yet. Little skepticism is good, but more trusting your heart is right. Because God's in there. Always keep the prayer, though, Lord, if there be any way in me, search me, O God, know my heart. See if there be any hurtful way, show me. And scriptures, we need to approach the scriptures wisely. We need to study them thoughtfully. 2 Timothy 2 will say, let's be workmen and not ashamed to handle God's word carefully. Let's understand literature and genre and context. Let's don't just play with the scriptures like it's a bunch of jumble of words. Let's understand where it came from, how to read it. That'll help us. And let's listen to wise counselors. Well, let those counselors be tested. Let character precede advice. No wonder in 1 Timothy chapter 3 on the advice given for elders, one is don't let a new convert become an elder. They need time to test their faith and their character in real time and space. But all to say, we are on the way. We are in the beautiful era of the new covenant prophesied to God by Jeremiah, which is fundamentally the answer to the question, how do we know the Lord? How do we know his voice? How do we discern if it's true? How do we know if it's him? I'll tell you where it's going to come from. It's going to come from that new heart beating in us, made possible by a relationship with Jesus Christ. To that end, every time the church comes around its table and celebrates communion, it's a reminder to us that the chemistry of the cosmos was changed, that Jesus has made a way for that new creation heart to get inside of us by giving us his life. And when we take a little piece of bread and dip it into a cup and eat it, and we say we do this in the name of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we are linking ourselves to that miracle and affirming our surrender to him and believing that that new life is surging in us. So we're going to end our sermon today coming to the table. Next week, typically when we have communion, the first Sunday is going to be a different Sunday. We have guests with us from the Pacific Southwest Conference. It's going to be a wonderful Sunday. But this is a Sunday for us to celebrate communion together, and particularly special for Jonathan, Sarah, and I, as this is our last Sunday as the threesome team up here on a Sunday leading together. And we wanted to bless you and serve communion together to you. And so I'm going to invite them to come forward with me. Communion is available to anybody in this room. It is an act of eating this little bread and juice as a way of saying, Jesus, I recognize and say yes to you. Even if your understanding is limited, if your heart yearns to come toward Jesus, his arms are outstretched toward you. We place these stools around our necks this morning, not to set ourselves apart in a religious kind of way, but to set apart the communion moment as sacred, as a sacrament